All right, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're here this evening. And we're here to talk about a man who was part of the movement from Europe to discover the New World. And he kind of happened upon America on his voyages, which really were intended to go to Asia and especially to India. One of the reasons Christopher Columbus was trying to find India and the Far East was because the traditional trade routes that had been established for many, many centuries had now been blocked by the Muslims and by the Moors, who were essentially not allowing Europe to go through this Silk Road trade routes anymore. And those European countries were desperate for those goods that they used to get from East Asia. And so Christopher Columbus took it upon himself, with his vast sailing experience, to assemble men and to put several voyage trips together, proposed them to multiple countries. He proposed it to Portugal. He proposed it to England. Eventually, he got Spain to sign off on it. Queen Isabella took some interest in his project and eventually funded it. And in 1492, he set sail. And as you know, the famous tale that he discovered America by doing this individual journey. And as we know, many years later, he actually was not the first to come to North America. And we'll talk some more about that detail. But he was the first to really open up the trade routes from Europe to North America and South America. He was the one who really established those routes that were coming to the Western Hemisphere. So anyway, we're going to talk about in Columbus Day week, Christopher Columbus, his life, his voyages, what he discovered, what he was able to accomplish, some of the ups and some of the downs that he discovered in his life. Some of the peoples he discovered, the places that he was able to take his voyages to, and in the end, his very mixed legacy, some good, some bad, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But there's a real reason why we still celebrate Columbus Day today, and that is that he was the first to really open up the Western Hemisphere, where, of course, we live today. So we're going to get into all the details of that. Let's take a look at his life first. Then we're going to get into a short video about his life and about his voyages and his discoveries. And then we'll also talk about the 25 little known facts about Christopher Columbus, which is one of our favorite parts of the program. So let's go ahead and jump into his life. So Christopher Columbus was born in 1451. He was also known as Cristoffa Corombo in Ligurian and Cristoforo Colombo in Italian. He was a Genoese explorer identified as Italian at the time, who also became famous in his own time as a man who discovered the New World, and since the 19th century CE is credited with discovery of the Western Hemisphere. Actually, owing to the early 16th century CE popularity of the published letters of a Florentine explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, detailing his 3 voyages in the New World between 1497 and 1504, the discovery of the Americas has been credited to him on world maps, beginning in 1506 CE, which is why the continents bear the feminine version of his name, America. Columbus made 4 voyages to the area in the Caribbean, exploring Cuba, Central America, South America, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and the Dominican Republic, as well as Haiti and the islands of Bahamas. He did these 4 voyages between 1492, which of course is his very famous first voyage that he did that you hear about in the history books. His last voyage ended in 1504. So he had a total of 12 years of discovery through those 4 different voyages. And we'll get into the details of all of those. The first voyage, which took place between 1492 and 1493, the second voyage took place in 1493 to 1496. His third voyage, 1498 to 1500, and his fourth voyage from 1502 to 1504. Columbus never set out to discover a new world. That was not his objective at all. He wanted to find a western sea route to the Far East to facilitate trade after the land route of the Silk Road between Europe and the East had been closed by the Ottoman Empire in 1453, initiating the so-called Age of Exploration, also known as the Age of Discovery. This launched many European sea expeditions. Columbus's first voyage brought him to one of the islands of the Bahamas on 12th of October, 1492, which he claimed in the name of the monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and his wife Isabella of Castile of Spain. His next 3 voyages were made to consolidate Spain's control of the region and to establish colonies in those areas. Columbus is acknowledged as the first to establish contact between Europe and the Americas, known as the Columbian Exchange, whereby people, plants, technology, and other aspects of culture passed between the old and the new world, transforming both and establishing the foundation for the modern age. Although modern-day detractors of Columbus cite the Norse community in Newfoundland as the first discovery of America, the Vikings under Leif Erikson, who landed in North America centuries before Columbus. But they really had no effect on the indigenous population, and their return to Greenland afterwards inspired no further expeditions. So what really set him apart, Columbus and Leif Erikson, several hundred years later, was Columbus not only went back 4 different times, but also opened up the age of discovery, which became, of course, as we know, the age when many, many Europeans would come to the Western Hemisphere. Columbus's journeys, by contrast, opened the way for later European expeditions, but he himself never claimed to have discovered America. The story of his discovery of America was actually established and first celebrated as a myth in the history of the life and voyages of Christopher Columbus by American author Washington Irving, who first published this in 1828. This narrative would eventually contribute to the establishment of Columbus Day as a United States holiday in 1906, observed up through the present. So pretty interesting that Christopher Columbus would definitely not have been as famous, and he wouldn't have had a day dedicated to him and his discoveries if it were not for the famous author Washington Irving, who at that time was one of the great authors, and everyone read his books. So very interesting what happened there, and it would have been interesting to see how much of a figure in history Columbus would have been without Washington Irving. In the 1970s, however, a revelation of Columbus and the effects of his voyages on the culture and people of the Americas has increasingly called for discarding this tradition in favor of honoring the indigenous people adversely affected by the first 4 expeditions he made to the New World and the poor treatment of the original population at the hands of the European immigrants afterwards. This debate continues to the present as to how much credit to give Columbus and his men for the discoveries and how much criticism to give them for the way they treated the indigenous people. Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy in 1451, which then was a region of Liguria, and only much later in 1861, so about 200 years later, became part of Italy. He had 3 brothers, Bartolomeo, Giovanni, and Giacomo, and a sister, Biancanita. His father, Domenico, was a weaver and tavern keeper whose love of sea travel would significantly influence young Columbus and his mother, Susanna, the housewife. Little is known of Columbus's early life, though he claims to have been sailing by age 10. But by the time he was 20 years old, he had already experienced a seamanship way of life, having traveled to Iceland and the Aegean Sea. By 1476, he was entrusted with his own command of trading vessels. He was married to the Portuguese noblewoman Filipa Moniz and had a son, Diego, by 1480. By 1485, he was piloting ships to areas along the coast of West Africa in the service of Portugal's trade interests. The climate in which Columbus had grown up was significantly different from that of his parents, in that the kinds of goods Europeans had grown used to were no longer available in the way they had once been. The overland trade routes to the east, known as the modern era Silk Road, had been in operation between Europe and China since 130 BC. So for about 1,000 years or more, this trade route had been there between Europe and China and India. It had opened up under the Han Dynasty. The Silk Road was comprised of numerous routes, parts of which fell under the control of one group or nationality or another at various times in history. The European explorer Marco Polo, who died in 1324, had traveled the Silk Road and dictated details of it in his book after he returned which provided later travelers with a kind of guide and also helped them establish distances between Europe and the East. And obviously, Marco Polo became a huge inspiration for Christopher Columbus much later. He was looking at Marco Polo, he was looking at his book, he was looking at the other explorers, and he was thinking to himself, how can I help the European nations find another route to the East Indies without having to go through the Ottoman Empire? Silk Road was predominantly controlled by the Mongol Empire until its fall in 1368, after which the Byzantine Empire kept goods flowing in both directions. The Byzantines fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, who then closed the overland routes and cut European merchants off from Eastern goods. In an effort to reestablish trade with the East, European merchants took to the sea, launching a so-called Age of Discovery. That is not to say that Europeans had no knowledge of sea travel at the time, nor that European merchants suddenly scrambled to build ships or hastily draw inaccurate maps. But the magnetic compass, known in Europe by 1180, using ancient texts such as Strabo's Geography and Pliny the Elder's Natural History, as well as the long-established maps, European pilots were able to navigate the waters and continue trade with the East via the Black Sea. The problem they faced, however, was Muslim Arab traders who controlled the number of sea routes to the east. Portuguese mariners began looking into possible sea routes to the east, and one contributor to this effort was Florentine astrologer and mathematician Paulo del Pozo, who had transcribed a map of the world of the ancient geographer Strabo and presented a copy to King Alfonso of Portugal, suggesting sailing west in order to reach the Cathay or China in the east. Alfonso V rejected Toscanelli's proposal, so the latter sent a copy of the map to Columbus, who by now had a reputation as an expert navigator and seaman. In 1474, Columbus was still sailing in the interests of Portugal at the time, and he and his brothers who were also engaged in working out a sea route to Cathay or China. Columbus had taught himself Latin, Spanish, and Portuguese, and so was able to access a wide range of documents and maps in developing his vision of a voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to establish a new trade route with Cathay. The Columbus brothers put together a plan, and in 1484, Columbus approached King John of Portugal to request funding. Columbus, basing his calculations on Toscanelli's map, Marco Polo's work, and other documents, estimated the distance from the Canary Islands to Cathay at around 2,300 miles. But King John rejected the plan on the grounds that Columbus's estimate of the distance was way too low, which actually proved to be true. The real distance was actually 12,200 miles. So it was about 6 times longer distance than Columbus thought. Columbus then brought his proposal to the government of Genoa and Venice, but was rejected by both. He then turned to Ferdinand II and Isabella I of Spain, who also rejected him, but were intrigued enough by his plan that they kept him on a retainer, paying him a significant sum to keep him from proposing the expedition to any other government. So they essentially locked up Columbus with a payment on retainer to make sure he wouldn't go propose it to someone else. Ferdinand and Isabella were in the midst of their own problems, trying to drive the Muslim Arabs, known as Moors, from their territory in an effort which has since become known as the Reconquista. The last stronghold of the Moors in Grenada fell in 1492, and afterwards Columbus was granted the 3 ships and the funding that he had requested. Columbus left port on August 3rd, 1492 in his famous ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. His main objective was reaching Cathay, but it also made clear that he was to claim any lands not already under sovereign nation for Spain and to honor the Catholic Church. To this end, he was given 2 official documents, a contract between him and the crown, proposing the monarchy have 90% of the profits, and also a letter of introduction from Ferdinand and Isabella requesting that any monarch that Columbus came in contact with provide him safe passage. In terms of his first voyage in 1492, he arrived at the island in the Caribbean on October 12, 1492, and was greeted by a large gathering of indigenous people on the beach. He summoned the captains of the Nina and the Pinta and rowed to shore along with the secretary of the fleet and the royal inspector. He knew he had not landed at Cathay, but believed he had discovered an island near to his objective, which, as far as he could tell, was not claimed by any sovereign nation, so he claimed it for Spain. This was duly noted by his witnesses. He was given to understand by the natives that their island was called Guianani, but he named it San Salvador, which is still its present name in the Bahamas. The natives were the Arawaks, probably also gave them the name that they call themselves, but he referred to them as Indios, and so established the use of the term Indian for the people of the region, and later for those in North, Central, and South America. So you can see he mistermed these people as Indians, even though they weren't anywhere close to East Asia, but he mistermed them, and that's why they're called Indians today. No mention is made of the reactions of the people who had come to greet them, and shortly afterwards, the 5 Europeans and the native islanders exchanged gifts of friendship. Following this first meeting with the natives, he then sailed off in search of Asia. He explored a number of other islands and the founding of Community Fortress at La Navidad on Haiti. With the permission of the local chieftain, consisting of 39 of his men, he headed back to Spain, taking a number of kidnapped natives with him, where news of his discovery spread quickly. European Christendom was thrilled at the prospect of a new world of future converts to Christ and the possibilities of unimaginable wealth, and Columbus was sent back in September 1493, a year later, to secure such possibilities. On his second voyage, Columbus arrived back in the New World as governor of the lands he had claimed, with a fleet of 17 ships this time, not just 3, 17, full of colonists to establish communities for Spain, as well as a number of dogs to be used in subduing the natives. The mastiffs had been successfully used by the Spanish against the Moors in the Reconquista, and so were included as an important asset in Columbus's second voyage. The dogs terrorized the native people, hunting them down, those who were accused of dereliction of duty, and broke any attempts at resistance at the European conquest. When he arrived in Jamaica in 1494, he was opposed by defenders on the beach until he released the savage mastiffs, which terrorized the indigenous warriors and scattered them. The second voyage established the economía system, in which Spanish settlers claimed a large tract of land on which the natives provided labor in return for food, shelter, and protection from those they labored for. By 1495, the indigenous population had decreased, according to later works of Las Casas, by 50,000. And although that number is considered an exaggeration by modern scholars, it is likely maybe low. The natives of the region were reduced from autonomous individuals to established culture to slaves who could be tortured or killed for any reason at any time, and suffered significant losses through European diseases they had no immunity from. Losses also stem from a significant portion of the populace shipped off to Europe as slaves. During the third voyage in 1498, Europeans had now firmly established themselves in the New World. Columbus had yet to find a way through the islands he had so far visited and reached Cathay. He was certain that the lands he had colonized for Spain were outliers of the continent of Asia. And so after his return to Spain in 1496, his third voyage was funded to establish this. Instead, he located the regions of modern-day Central and South America. By the time Columbus colonists were actively engaged in capturing and selling the natives as slaves and further abusing them daily. Columbus rejected to this treatment of the natives and punished the colonists severely, which resulted in charge of tyranny and corruption. So you can see Columbus was very much against this mistreatment of the locals. He and his brother Diego were arrested and sent back to Spain to answer charges. They were acquitted by Ferdinand and Isabella, equipped with new ships and sent back to the New World. So you can see he and his brother were very much against this mistreatment by the European settlers of the locals. And because they were against it, they actually were sent back to Spain after being arrested. They were sent back in chains to Spain. although Ferdinand and Isabella realized they were not guilty and eventually let them out of jail and then gave them some more ships and sent them back. In terms of the fourth voyage, 1502, Columbus returned with a fleet of 30 ships, 29 of which were lost in a storm off of Santo Domingo, to find that the regional governors no longer wanted or needed him there. He was thought to have mismanaged the colonies by defending the indigenous peoples and interfering with the slave trade, which had cost the slave traders and the Spanish crown considerable financial loss. On his own, Columbus explored the islands of Honduras. He mapped Costa Rica and other sites and was sailing on when a storm drove his ship towards Jamaica, where it was wrecked. The natives despised him and refused any aid, and the regional governors of the area felt the same and would not send a rescue ship. Columbus finally frightened the natives into assisting him by claiming he would take the great light from the sky if they did not aid and help him. And he accurately predicted the lunar eclipse of February 29, 1504, claiming to have restored the light once help was promised. He and his men were eventually rescued, largely through their own efforts, and Columbus returned to Spain, where he was ill in health, and he died in Valladolid in May of 1506. Prior to the publication in 1828 of the History of Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus by Washington Irving, Columbus was almost unknown in the United States. His book on Columbus, more historical or romantic fiction than history, was interpreted as a scholarly work on the life and adventures of an intrepid European explorer who had discovered America and went on to inform United States history up to this day. Columbus never claimed to have discovered America, and neither is there anything in his journals or writings of near contemporaries to suggest that scholars of this day believed the earth was flat while he proved it was round. Nor did he get lost while searching for a route to India, landed in some strange place where he thought was his destination, so he named the people Indians. Most, if not all, of these myths commonly cited as history concerning Columbus were creations of Irving, who was only trying to tell a good story. Irving's Columbus was a brave and noble adventurer who risked his life and that of his crew to extend European knowledge of the world and establish a vital link between Old World and New World. The book was so popular that it informed the decision of U.S. President Benjamin Harrison to proclaim a national day of observance in Columbus's honor in 1892, on the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival. The state of Colorado would later be the first to observe this holiday in 1906, and other states followed suit thereafterwards. The present movement to rename and rededicate Columbus Day in honor of indigenous people is understandable and admirable, but the opposing side, arguing to continue the tradition of honoring him, also has merit, especially when one considers what it meant to Italian Americans, frequently persecuted in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. To have an American hero defined as Italian by Irving and recognized as such by American majority was a huge deal for Italians. It was largely the efforts of the Italian American community groups, in fact, which helped establish the holiday to begin with. Healing past wounds must begin with a dialogue which recognized the underlying causes and long-term effects of Columbus's atrocities, while also acknowledging his accomplishments. However one judges Columbus in the present day, he was the product of the time who behaved towards non-Europeans precisely as one who would expect in the 15th century European Christians to do. Unfortunately, far better than the colonizers and conquerors who came to the New World after him. So really, it is a mixed bag when it comes to Christopher Columbus's legacy, as you can see. But largely, he was trying to espouse on behalf of the indigenous people. He was against the slave trade. He did not want them to be abused. He did not want them to be mistreated. And because of that, he actually got shunned by the European settlers of that time and the European settlers later. So it's a mixed bag how you look at him. He was incredibly brave in his voyages and his discoveries. He led a tremendous age of discoveries we've talked about before. He did have a mixed bag in terms of the way he treated the indigenous people, but for the most part, he and his brother, of all the people that landed at that time, were probably the best of the indigenous people of the entire group. And so it is a mixed bag in terms of his legacy, but he should be honored along with the indigenous people. I'm actually for both of them being honored on the same day. So let's go ahead and take a look at a quick video about Christopher Columbus, and we will come back and talk about it on the other side.
During the 14th century, the port city of Genoa was a powerful marine republic, with ships sailing throughout the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. It is easy to imagine the intrigue of the boats and their crews, speaking foreign tongues and telling tales of far-off lands. Many boys, lured by the call of the sea, sought employment as cabin boys, perhaps in a determined effort to see the world beyond that of their parents. One such boy was a young wool weaver's son called Cristoforo Colombo, who we would come to know as Christopher Columbus. According to his own writings, Columbus first went to sea in 1461 at the age of 10. By the time he was 20, he was employed as a ship's captain. In 1477, he moved to Lisbon, married, and began studying sea charts, geometry, and cartography. Both himself and one of his brothers, Bartholomew, became skilled at drawing maps of the sea. Columbus continued to captain many ships and piloted a fleet of 10 ships to Guinea in 1481. Trade was booming during the 14th century, but the Silk Road, in operation for over 1,500 years, had been closed off by the Ottoman Turks. The Silk Road was a network of paths that interconnected many different civilizations in the East and West. It had flourished during the reign of the Mongols, as, despite their fearsome reputation, they built their economy on trade. But when the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, travel along the Silk Road became much more treacherous. Commerce became much more difficult as the Ottoman Turks boycotted trade with China and closed many routes. It was for these reasons that Europeans were desperate to find an alternative way to reach the East. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz sailed to India around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. However, this journey proved impractical, and discussions within the maritime community soon turned to talk of a journey west. Contrary to popular myth, people had known the Earth was round since the 3rd century BCE, when Hellenistic astronomers in modern-day Greece calculated the Earth's circumference. The age of exploration was well underway, and Europeans had already started claiming land previously undiscovered by the West. Columbus saw a way of achieving notoriety and riches beyond his station when he petitioned the King and Queen of Portugal to finance a journey designed to discover a new trade route to the Indies and China. Columbus had already achieved infamy with his tales of his navigational expertise and seafaring experiences. He was known for an extraordinary expedition to Iceland, known then as Thule, but many historians now think this claim was more clever marketing than fact. Columbus had been inspired by tales of the famous explorer Marco Polo and dreamt of exploring the unknown. In 1484, Columbus was granted an audience with King John II of Portugal. Despite interest from the king's advisors assessed that the trip Columbus proposed would not be feasible. Undeterred, Columbus decided to take his proposal to Spain. King Ferdinand was away, defending southern Spain from Muslim invaders. But Queen Isabella heard of Columbus's intended quest and became interested. After hearing of Bartholomew Diaz's attempt to reach India around the Cape of Good Hope, Spain was worried that Portugal would be the first to get to the Indies by sea. However, both the Queen's confessor and the king were against financing Columbus's voyage. Columbus decided to continue to France, looking for financial backing. But on the way, his story caught the attention of a prior called Juan Perez. Perez was entranced by Columbus's ideas and saw it as a loss for Spain should they go to France. Both Perez and an expert in cosmography and astronomy, Dr. Garcia Hernandez, petitioned the Queen on Columbus's behalf. And in 1492, Queen Isabella sent word that Columbus should return to the Spanish court. Fresh from a successful military campaign, the king and queen accepted Columbus's proposal, despite his outrageous demands. Columbus wanted this voyage to be his making and insisted on 1/10 of the profits from any discoveries he made, as well as the titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea and High Admiral of Castile. Columbus was supplied with money, 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and began to employ a crew. As well as seamen, Columbus recruited 2 barbers, a physician, a secretary, a silversmith, an assayer, and an interpreter. With this crew assembled and ships in good shape, the small fleet set sail into the unknown on August 3, 1492. Little did they know, they were about to change the shape of the world, and that the repercussions of this voyage would echo throughout history in the centuries to come. Once at sea, there were no physical points of reference for position or traveling speed. Knowing the ocean's vastness and using only an hourglass to mark the time, Columbus had a monumental task ahead of him. At night, he could use the North Star and the Greek invention of the astrolabe to roughly measure the distance they had traveled. Historians do not know if Columbus referred to any maps or projections during his voyage, but he was versed in many ancient astronomers' speculations about the size of the Earth, in particular the Greeks, the Romans, and the Arabs. Columbus had used these famous scholars' estimates to argue that the journey to the Indies across the Atlantic was perfectly feasible. However, he had not considered that the Arab miles were longer than Roman miles, and wrongfully assumed that the Arab estimations agreed with the smaller of the Greek and Roman estimations. If he had realized his error, he might have known that the land he had encountered was actually a new continent, not the East Indies. Although Columbus's original logs had been lost, copies were made, and records have survived, giving us detailed information about this infamous voyage. A Dominican historian called Bartolomé de las Casas wrote in 1530 that Columbus kept 2 logs of distance. The one he shared with his crew underestimated the distance they had traveled to dispel the sailors' fear once they had lost sight of land. Columbus reported that many of the men were trepidatious of being so far into the ocean, especially once they could only see water surrounding them. Just over a month into the voyage, Columbus informed his crew that they had only traveled 2.5 leagues, when, in actuality, they had sailed 48. Toward the end of September, many men thought their journey was almost over. After spotting several birds and tufts of grass, Columbus had to explain to the hopeful men that these were signs they were near uncharted islands rather than the mainland. After more than a month at sea, even Columbus started to feel concerned. Only a slight wind was blowing, and huge waves made progress very slow. Luckily for Columbus, the wind picked up as the crew was on the point of wishing to return to Spain. When Columbus determined they were now 2,200 miles west of the Canary Islands, he must have been both astonished and worried, as he had estimated that the entire journey would be no more than 1,700 miles. Feeling they must be nearing the end of their voyage, everyone on board the ship celebrated when the cry of "Land Ahoy!" rang out on September 25th. Jubilation soon turned to dismay when it was discovered they had been looking at a large cloud bank on the horizon. By early October, tensions were rising. Many of the crew thought they had overshot Japan, probably spurred on by the constant sightings of sandpipers that must have come from nearby islands. Columbus followed his instincts and continued westward, unperturbed by the thought that they had missed land. On October 7th, the crew of the Pinta saw a large flock of birds flying west-southwest. Knowing that Portuguese sailors often find land by following flocks of birds, Columbus ordered the ships to change course and headed in the direction in which the birds were flying. More birds were seen, and hopes were high that they had finally reached their goal. Unfortunately, they were again met with nothing but sea. October 10th was tense, with talk of mutiny and a retreat back to Spain. But things changed on the night of October 11th. A cane and an iron object were seen floating in the sea, along with a land plant and a small board. As the sailors roused each other from their sleep, they saw a small light in the distance and were convinced it was the flickering of a candle. At 2 a.m, spurred on by the promise of a silk doublet and an annual income to whomever first saw land, a sailor called Rodrigo de Triani looked out into the night and shouted, "Land ahoy!" For the first time in 2 months, the adventurers were actually looking at solid land. Although the men were confident that they had finally reached the Indies, they had instead landed on an island in the Bahamas. As soon as they landed on the morning of October 11th, Columbus claimed the land in the name of the Spanish king and queen. The men immediately ran into the native inhabitants of the island, who they mistook to be Indian, but were members of the Taino, Lucayan, and Arawak tribes. Despite popular belief, Columbus did not set foot on American soil during this first voyage. and had not yet realized that he had failed to discover a new route to the East Indies. He conducted a fruitless search for the riches he had promised to his benefactors, and on his return to Spain, Columbus left behind a makeshift colony on an island he dubbed Hispaniola. Disturbingly, he recorded his impressions of the indigenous people as, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all." Returning from his first voyage, he brought spices, gold, and some natives back with him. After 6 months, he was able to return to the Americas, finding his settlement destroyed. He then enslaved hundreds of indigenous peoples and continued to search for gold and riches with which to impress his patrons back in Spain. After returning from the Caribbean islands, Columbus found himself out of favor in the Spanish courts. He had not supplied nearly enough riches, neither had he found a new route to India. In 1498, the King and Queen of Spain agreed to fund another expedition across the Atlantic. On August 11th, Columbus reached the South American mainland, planting a flag on the shores of Venezuela, and still believing he would be able to find passage to India. It was only after exploring the Orinoco River that he realized he had stumbled across a continent that was hitherto unknown to the rest of the world. While Columbus is credited with bringing the Americas to the West's attention, he never knew the full extent of the continent, only ever getting as far as South America. The closest he got to achieving his original goal of finding passage to the East was 4 years before his death, when he reached Panama, only to be forced to return to Spain empty-handed due to losing 2 of his 4 ships to storms. Columbus was not the only Western traveler to accidentally arrive in America, but he is undoubtedly the most famous. His journey west to reach the East is a captivating one, despite the long-lasting and devastating repercussions of this trip. Columbus's legacy remains highly controversial, and his travels to South America would have many far-reaching and unexpected effects on the world.
So as you can see, there's a lot of things out of that video we need to discuss. The first one is Cristoffa Corombo, or Cristoffa Colombo, as he was called as a little boy, started his activities in seafaring and being around ships at 10 years old, working as a cabin boy. And this gave him a lot of experience being around sailors, being around ships, understanding how they work. He kind of grew up along those lines throughout his teenage years. And so by the time he was 20 years old, he was an incredibly experienced seafaring captain. And as you heard, in his early life, he actually led several expeditions outside of Portugal at the time, which is where he was living. The first one being to the country of Iceland. Back then, it had only been discovered by the Vikings, and so he was the first Western European explorer to actually go there from Portugal. He actually had discovered several other islands as well, and so by the time he was the age of 20, he was quite experienced. And so when he went to go pitch these voyages to the different regimes in the different countries, Portugal, France, England, Spain, he really knew what he was talking about. He understood what he wanted his plan to be. He had worked up a solid plan for this big voyage with his brothers. And he had a good sense for how much money he needed to complete the trip. And as you saw, he went and pitched it to all these countries. Spain was the only one that actually bid off on the plan after many, many different pitches. He had several other countries that were interested, but did not bite off on it, did not fund it, said they didn't think it was feasible to get to the other side of the world. And so, interestingly enough, as you saw, you had Ferdinand and Isabella. They finally funded it. They wanted him to do everything in his exploration on behalf of the Kingdom of Spain. And anything that he found, Spain would take 90%, he would take 10%. And then those countries would be established for Spain as part of the Spanish monarchy and empire. And so this is the plan that Columbus went forward with. As you saw, he did not realize at first that he had discovered a new world. He did not realize he had discovered a new continent. He didn't really realize until his third voyage. He finally figured it out when he was on the South American continent, and he was going across Venezuela and Costa Rica, that he had discovered a new continent. It was at that point it dawned on him, and he had taken very copious notes and journals, lots of drawings. He had mapped out many rivers and lakes along his route. And so then when he went back to Spain after that third voyage into his fourth voyage, he now knew what he was dealing with. He realized he had not found a route to the Indies, but he had done something even bigger with a larger impact on world history. And that is that he had discovered the Western Hemisphere. He had discovered the Americas. Along with Amerigo Vespucci, who you heard earlier, was another explorer at the time who had ended up being named after. He was just hugely consequential in terms of being one of the great explorers of world history, and of course opened up the age of discovery, as we talked about earlier. Some other interesting things there. We mentioned that his legacy is very mixed, and it really is. All the great things that he brought in terms of the discovery, in terms of bringing technology and culture and civilization and European knowledge and all those things to the Americas. That was the upside. The downside, of course, was the treatment by his men, and in some cases by him, of the local indigenous people, and the taking of the resources of the land that they found, which of course was his charge in the first place. So it is a mixed record, but a very interesting one, a very consequential one. And what we do here in Traveling Through History is we look at consequential and important historical figures, and we bring them to you, and you can make up your own judgment as to their importance. Of course, we bring this Christopher Columbus review to you the week of Columbus Day. We hope you had a fantastic Columbus Day with your family. And let's go ahead and take a look at the Christopher Columbus 25 interesting facts. All right, number one, Christopher Columbus made 4 voyages across the seas to discover and explore the New World. We talked a little bit about this earlier. You can see the timeline on the left there. Shows you some of the major aspects of his life and the major times that he did these discovery missions. He led 4 expeditions to the New World, visiting the Caribbean islands, the Gulf of Mexico, the mainlands of South and Central America. He had discovered the New World for Europe, whose riches would help Spain become the world's richest and most influential nation over the next century. At first, he thought he had discovered a new route to Asia and the East Indies, but finally realized he had discovered a new continent, later called America. He was the first explorer to establish a European presence in the New World, but he was not the first to discover North America. And we talked a little bit about that. Number 2, Columbus didn't set out to prove the earth was round. Forget the myths perpetuated by everyone from Washington Irving to Bugs Bunny. There was no need for Christopher Columbus to debunk the flat earthers. The ancient Greeks had already done so. As early as the 6th century BC, the Greek mathematician Pythagoras surmised the world was round, and 2 centuries later, Aristotle backed him up with an astronomical observation. By 1492, most educated people knew the planet was not shaped like a pancake, and that included Christopher Columbus in his writings in his journal. So he was well aware the earth was round and that it was not flat. And he was not out to prove that, like the myth was perpetuated in the Washington Irving book. Number 3, Columbus was not the first European to cross the Atlantic Ocean. We just mentioned that a little bit earlier. That distinction is generally given to the Norse Viking Leif Erikson from Iceland, who is believed to have landed in present-day Newfoundland around 1000 AD, almost 5 centuries before Columbus set sail. Some historians even claim that Ireland's St. Brendan or other Celtic people crossed the Atlantic before Erikson. While the United States commemorates Columbus, even though he never set foot on the North American mainland, with parades and a federal holiday, Leif Erikson Day is October 9th, which receives little fanfare. And you can see a picture there of Leif Erikson when he arrived in Newfoundland, and he's climbing up a mountain to claim it on behalf of his crew. There's another picture there in the bottom center of Leif and his crew on their ship actually pointing to Newfoundland when they saw landfall. And there's a fantastic statue there of Leif in front of a very famous church in Reykjavik, Iceland, as a tribute to the great explorer. Number 4, 3 countries refused to back Columbus's voyage, and we talked about this a little bit in the opening. For nearly a decade, Columbus lobbied European monarchies to bankroll his quest to discover a western sea route to Asia. In Portugal, England, and France, the response was the same: no thank you. The experts told Columbus his calculations were wrong and that the voyage would take much longer than he thought. Royal advisors in Spain raised similar concerns to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, but the Queen funded his effort anyway after some consternation. Turns out the naysayers were right. Columbus dramatically underestimated the Earth's circumference and the size of the oceans. Luckily for him, he ran into the uncharted Americas. And you can see a great picture there of Columbus at the court in front of Ferdinand and Isabella, making his pitch for this voyage and making a pitch to be funded. Number 5, Nina and Pinta were not the actual names of the two of Columbus's ships. In 15th century Spain, ships were traditionally named after saints. Salty sailors, however, bestowed less than sacred names upon their vessels. Mariners dubbed one of the 3 ships on Columbus's 1492 voyage as the Pinta, which was Spanish for the painted one or prostitute. The Santa Clara, meanwhile, was nicknamed the Nina in honor of its owner, Juan Nino. Although Santa Maria is called by its official name, its nickname was La Galega, after the province of Galicia in which it was built. So you can see all of these 3 ships, and you see 2 fantastic pictures there, one on the left, one on the right, of artist renderings of what they might have looked like on the open seas. And all of them, as you see, the sailors gave them nicknames. Number 6, the Santa Maria wrecked on Columbus's historic voyage. On Christmas Eve, 1492, a cabin boy ran Columbus's flagship, Santa Maria, into a coral reef of the northern coast of Hispaniola, which he called it later, which is near present-day Cap Haitian, Haiti. Its crew spent a very unmerry Christmas salvaging the Santa Maria's cargo. Columbus returned to Spain aboard the Nina, but he had to leave nearly 40 crew members behind to start the first European settlement in the Americas, La Navidad. When Columbus returned to the settlement in the fall of 1493, none of the crew were found alive. So pretty amazing. He went back a year later and couldn't find any of the crew that he had left, the 40 men. So I wonder what happened to them. You see a picture there on the right of the Santa Maria as it ran aground and all the crews all around it trying to help and trying to offload all the items that were on the ship. Number 7, Columbus returned to Spain in chains in 1500. You see a picture there of Columbus all chained up on a ship being taken back to Spain. Columbus's governance of Hispaniola could be brutal and tyrannical. Colonists complained to the monarchy about mismanagement, and a royal commissioner dispatched to Hispaniola arrested Columbus in August 1500, brought him back to Spain in chains. Although Columbus was stripped of his governorship, King Ferdinand not only granted the explorer his freedom, but subsidized a 4th voyage. Another interesting aspect of the lead-in, as you heard, was one of the reasons they also turned him in was he was starting to advocate on behalf of the locals and on behalf of the indigenous people. And he was starting to discourage them being put into slavery. And the local people that were trying to settle that area didn't like that. Number 8, a lunar eclipse saved Columbus's life. In February 1504, a desperate Columbus was stranded in Jamaica, abandoned by half his crew and denied food by the islanders. The heavens that he relied on for navigation, however, would guide him safely once again. Knowing from his almanac that a lunar eclipse was coming on February 29, 1504, Columbus warned the islanders that his god was upset with their refusal of food and that the moon would rise inflamed with wrath as an expression of divine displeasure. On the appointed night, the eclipse darkened the moon and turned it red, and the terrified islanders offered provisions and beseeched Columbus to ask his God for mercy. So pretty amazing. He used this piece of knowledge that he knew was coming. You can see some great pictures there of him pointing towards the moon, and it scared the islanders into actually assisting him and saved his life. Number 9, even in death, Columbus continued to cross the Atlantic. Following his death in 1506, Columbus was buried in Valladolid, Spain, and then moved to Seville. At the request of his daughter-in-law, the bodies of Columbus and his son Diego were shipped across the Atlantic to Hispaniola and interred at Santo Domingo Cathedral in Hispaniola, or Haiti. When the French captured the island in 1795, the Spanish dug up remains thought to be those of the explorer and moved them to Cuba, before returning them to Seville after the Spanish-American War in 1898. However, a box with human remains and the explorer's name was discovered inside the Santo Domingo Cathedral in 1877. DNA testing in 2006 found evidence that at least some of the remains in Seville were those of Columbus. The Dominican Republic has refused to let the other remains be tested. It could be possible that, as appropriate, pieces of Columbus are both in the New World and the Old World. Pretty wild there that his body kept being taken back and forth across the Atlantic, and that pieces of him are in both places. Number 10, the heirs of Columbus and the Spanish monarchy were in litigation until 1790 for almost 300 years. After the death of Columbus, his heirs waged a lengthy legal battle with the Spanish crown, claiming that the monarchy shortchanged them on money and profits due to the explorer. Most of the Colombian lawsuits were settled by 1536, but the legal proceedings nearly dragged on until the 300th anniversary of Columbus's famous voyage. The family felt they had finally received their due all those years later. And you can see some pictures in several of the courts of both Columbus and Columbus's family arguing on behalf of the family that they had not received the profits that they were due under the agreement. Number 11, Christopher Columbus was not his real name. In Italian, he is known as Cristoforo Colombo, which was long thought to be his birth name, and in Spanish as Cristobal Colon. But he was also been referred to by himself and others as Cristiol, Cristovom, and Christophorus de Colombo, and even Sposo de Colon. There is even a theory that he adopted his name from a pirate named Colombo. So pretty interesting. Lots of questions and open questions around his name, what he was born as, what he was called as a young man, and how his name evolved to being what we know it today, Christopher Columbus. One piece of evidence they have out of his journal, you can see there his signature, which looks like Christopher Colon. So that probably was the name that he was going by at the time. Number 12, he was not great at math. The exact size of the planet Earth was unknown, and there was two main ways of measuring degrees of latitude. The method developed by Greek philosopher Posidonius and the method developed by medieval Arabs. In making his own calculations, Columbus argued that the circumference yielded by both methods was the same, ignoring or forgetting that Arab miles were longer than Roman miles. Using that data, which ultimately rendered the planet about 25% smaller, Columbus assured his backers that his small wooden ships could make it from Spain to Japan in 30 days. Some scholars think Columbus willfully misrepresented the distance. I guess we'll never know if he misrepresented or if he miscalculated, but either way, what he presented was a much shorter trip than it actually was. Number 13, Columbus wasn't the first to sight new land. Among our interesting facts about Christopher Columbus, this is a contested one. Apparently, during the famous voyage of 1492, Columbus promised a reward, a nice pile of gold, to the first person to spot land as they sailed. And this person was Rodrigo de Triana. And you saw in the video his name and a little mention about him. He was a sailor who caught the first glimpse of the small island in the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. But Columbus didn't pay up, boasting to everyone that he had in fact spotted a hazy bit of light the previous night, but didn't mention it at the time, and he wasn't sure. So kind of a screw job he did here on his sailor that he didn't pay up. Columbus went on to name the island San Salvador, and Rodrigo de Triana has been honored in the form of a statue in the park in Seville. You see some pictures there of Columbus with his telescope and also with some of his men as he was awaiting landing on land. Number 14, he was incredibly religious. This is perhaps one of the least surprising facts about Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus believed that he had been singled out by God to embark on these journeys of discovery. This is why many islands, like the aforementioned San Salvador, have religious names. This example was because Columbus hoped the natives would be able to find salvation in Christ, thanks to his help and to the Catholic Church. In his later life, he would wear a plain Franciscan habit at all times, He was an incredibly wealthy admiral at this point, but looked more like a monk. You can see what he would have looked like later in his life after he retired from sailing. And you see a picture on the top right there of one of their landings on one of the Caribbean islands and the cross that they carried with them. And they're actually holding a church service with themselves and with the locals. Number 15, Columbus Day is celebrated throughout the world. One of the most contemporary facts about Christopher Columbus is that he has a day dedicated to him. And we talked a little bit about the history earlier, why he got a day in the United States. Christopher Columbus Day is celebrated around the world to mark the anniversary of the explorer's arrival in the Americas. It is celebrated in many places. The date was 12th of October, 1492, although it would actually have been 21st of October according to the modern Gregorian calendar. Columbus Day is now celebrated on the second Monday of October each year. Columbus is a huge part of European and American history, which is why they celebrate Christopher Columbus Day now. In the United States, the moniker of Indigenous Peoples Day was also added to the same day for celebration. And I talked a little bit about that earlier. I think that's very appropriate that you now have a Columbus Day and an Indigenous Peoples Day, which share the same day and both celebrated. Number 16, in 1473, Columbus' apprenticeship let him gain experience. Age 22, Christopher Columbus started a business agent apprenticeship for various families. In the Spinola, Centurion, Di Negro families were important in Genoa, and this was considered a fantastic opportunity for Columbus to be this apprentice. Over the next few years, he traveled to various locations: Chios, which is an Aegean island, Bristol, Galway, and even Iceland. He gained tremendous experience with running an operation this large and to help discover multiple faraway lands. You see some great pictures there of him in his various voyages in his 20s and going across the oceans to find new locations and new places. Number 17, from 1482 to 1485, he had travel and tragedy. During these years, Columbus traveled a lot. He was trading along the coasts of West Africa as far as Elmina at the Guinea coast and what is now Ghana. But while he was away, his wife Philippa died. Reports of exactly when and how she perished are incomplete, and nobody really knows what happened. But the story goes that it was 1485, and Columbus was in Castile at the time. He returned to Lisbon. Philippa was buried in the Capella de Piedade, the Chapel of Piety, at the Carmel convent alongside her sister and brother-in-law. Columbus settled her estate and then took their son Diego with him on his travels the next year. You see a picture there of Columbus on the left and his wife Philippa in the middle, and then a great book there called 1492. I highly recommend. It's a really excellent book. It talks all about his travels that year. 18, in 1493, Columbus launched voyage number 2. In September, Columbus tried again. This time he had 17 ships and 1,200 men, so he had really expanded his outreach on voyage number 2, with enough supplies to establish permanent colonies in the New World. Priests and farmers and soldiers traveled in his midst. They were to be the colonists or colonizers of the new territories he had discovered. After a brief stop at the Canary Islands, Columbus came across various islands. One he named Dominica, another Mary Gallant. He passed Les Saints and stopped at Guadeloupe. Columbus named the island Santa Maria de Guadalupe de Extremadura, and he spent a week in November exploring it. This exact route of the voyage isn't certain, but it is agreed that Columbus sighted and named several islands throughout this journey. He also named Redonda and St. Kitts and Antigua and plenty more. So you can imagine he was just really exploring Cuba and Hispaniola and Jamaica and all these different islands throughout his journeys. In later November, Columbus settled in La Isabela for a short time before returning to Spain. Of course, La Isabela is now known as the Dominican Republic. You can see some of the pictures there on the right of his various ships on this journey, and then all the different locations that he traveled to on this voyage number 2. He made a lot of different stops. Quite a fascinating journey. Number 19, in 1498, he made his third voyage, and Columbus discovered South America. You can see a picture there on the top left of what this voyage entailed. This time he stopped briefly in the islands, but spent most of his time in South America. In May, with 6 ships this time, Columbus set out once more. 3 ships went straight to Hispaniola with supplies for those who were settled there, and Columbus took the further 3 ships in another direction, south of the Caribbean, in search of passage to Asia that he so craved. While crossing the Atlantic, visiting the Canary Islands and Cape Verde, Columbus discovered what is now known as compass variation. After being stranded for a few days, the crew had a little water, so it headed for Dominica, but spotted Trinidad for the first time. He stocked up there in Trinidad before Columbus explored the Gulf of Paria, and this is when he touched the mainland of South America. And he spent quite a few years in South America, really discovering all the different countries there, mainly in Costa Rica and Venezuela. That's where he spent most of his time. Number 20, in 1502, the fourth and final voyage by Columbus and his men. Research led Christopher Columbus to embark on one final voyage. This was in search of the Strait of Malacca to the Indian Ocean. His brother and youngest son, Fernando, came along on this voyage. They sailed to Ariza, Martinique, Santo Domingo, Jamaica, and Central America, exploring Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Columbus also sighted the Cayman Islands, got caught in a major storm, and found himself and his men stranded in Jamaica. Columbus eventually returned to Spain in November of 1504 with lots of new facts about the New World, but having never found a path to India on any of his 4 trips. So pretty incredible. And you can see a picture there on the bottom left of what this journey entailed. Again, he stopped by all the islands he had discovered before. He discovered several new islands, and then he actually did some exploration more on Central America this time than he did before. You see a picture there when he actually went and discovered Central America, especially Panama. That artist rendering is him discovering Panama. Number 21, Columbus was made famous by author Washington Irving. Columbus's journeys opened the way for later European expeditions, but he himself never claimed to have discovered America. The story of his discovery of America was established and first celebrated in A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus by the American author Washington Irving, who published that book in 1828, and his narrative, largely fictional, would eventually contribute to the establishment of Columbus Day as the United States holiday in 1906, observed until present. And you can see pictures of Washington Irving's book there on the left and the right, 2 different covers for that book. And then there's a picture of Washington Irving there in the middle. So he really glorified and romanticized Columbus's life and his discoveries, and really made the Western culture, and especially the United States, very fascinated in Columbus and his exploits. So pretty interesting. Columbus largely would not have been very famous if it were not for Washington Irving. Number 22, Columbus took his inspiration from Marco Polo. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, and it was mentioned in the video. The climate in which Columbus had grown up was significantly different from that of his parents, in that the kinds of goods Europeans had grown used to were no longer available in the way they had been once. The overland trade routes to the east, known in the modern era as Silk Road, had been in operation in Europe and China since 130 BC, when it was opened under the Han Dynasty. The European explorer Marco Polo traveled the Silk Road and dictated details of it in his book after he returned, which provided later travelers with a kind of guide and also helped them establish distances between Europe and the East. You see a picture there on the bottom left of all of Marco Polo's travels from Europe through the Middle East and all through the East. So India and China and all the different areas that he explored. And there's a great book that is largely based on his notes and journals that he took on his trips, called The Travels of Marco Polo. So this really was largely Columbus's inspiration, was trying to do the sea version of Marco Polo's travels. Number 23, Columbus thought there was an open ocean to China. Columbus left port on August 3rd, 1492, in his famous ships Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. His main objective was reaching China, or Cathay, as they called it back then. But it was also made clear that he was to claim any lands not already under sovereign nation for Spain and to honor the Catholic Church. To this end, he was given two official documents, a contract between him and the crown promising the monarchy 90% of the profits of the venture in return for funding, and stipulating that Columbus was awarded the position of governor of any lands he took for the crown. He also was given a letter of introduction from Ferdinand and Isabella requesting any monarch Columbus came in contact with to provide him safe passage and provision, as his mission was in the service of the Christian faith. And you can see on the left was the world according to Christopher Columbus in 1490. This was 2 years before he sailed. This is what he thought it looked like. He thought, you can see the picture there of Africa, the picture of Europe. He thought he would sail from Spain directly across the Atlantic Ocean, hit Japan, and then hit mainland China, which he called Cathay. What he did not know, of course, at the time when he made this map was that there's a huge continent in the middle before he got there, and that was North and South America. So, of course, that was a huge discovery he made, and a huge shock to him in his first couple of voyages that there was no passage all the way across the ocean. There was a huge continent in the middle. Number 24, Christopher Columbus and his men confused mermaids with manatees. Most mermaid sightings were most likely manatees, dugongs, or stellar sea cows. In fact, Christopher Columbus spotted 3 manatees near the Dominican Republic and would later write that mermaids are not half as beautiful as they are painted. His men often pointed at these sea animals and said that they must be mermaids, since they had never seen such creatures. You can see a picture on the bottom left of a rendering done at the time of a mermaid and a manatee. And there's a picture of Christopher Columbus and what he imagined a mermaid would look like according to the paintings. Number 25, Christopher Columbus never made it to North America. This is one of the real interesting things. We celebrate him for discovering the New World, and he did, along with several others, but he never made it to North America. He was the first European to sight Bahamas archipelago and then island later named Hispaniola, now split into Haiti and the Dominican Republic. On his subsequent voyages, he went further south to Central and South America, Cuba, and the Caribbean islands. He never got close to what is now called the United States or Canada. So it's a really interesting fact, and I think there's a real misconception by people that somehow he discovered North America, but that definitely was not the case. His discoveries were all Caribbean islands, Central and South America. Of course, he opened up the age of discovery, which then brought many, many more voyagers and discoverers in the hundreds of years after that. As many know, we had the Pilgrims that came over and settled up in Massachusetts, and we had the settlements in the Virginias with Johnstown. So he definitely started the spark as his voyages really took everybody's imagination in Europe to a higher level. Hopefully you enjoyed that and you learned a lot about Christopher Columbus, about the 25 interesting facts. Learned a lot from his video and from the opening in the program about his life. He was a consequential figure, obviously very famous, made by Washington Irving in his book, but also just due to his discovery, his exploration, and his many voyages to the New World that ended up opening the Age of Discovery, which of course there are many, many more explorers that came after him. He became the inspiration for many, many explorers after him, very similar to how Marco Polo was for him. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You'll want to dig some more into Christopher Columbus and his life and his legacy and his accomplishments, and even some of the more complicated aspects of his background, such as how he treated the indigenous people, which was not always great. Although I will again reiterate that he did not agree with the slave trade, was against it, and ended up actually being sent back to Spain because he was trying to prevent the slave trade from happening. So definitely a very complicated legacy, but one you should look into. So happy Columbus Day, happy Indigenous Peoples Day, and hope you love history as much as we do. Hope you have a great night.
ever to